TV. Welcome to the first in-person meeting of the Board of Finance in over 2 years. And I can say sincerely, it is so nice to see everyone. So thank you for being here, and it's nice to see your faces. We'll begin with the Pledge of Allegiance, please, guys. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I'm going to start the meeting first by thanking SCTV for filming this and for all their Zoom filming the last 2 years. Very much appreciated. And to our clerk, Marion, who always does an outstanding job with our minutes. We're going to adjust the agenda because we have a supplemental appropriation that we need to get done first. Do we have Derek yet?
I'm here.
Oh, he's there.
Yeah,
Great.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can.
We got you.
Hi, Derek.
Great.
So we have Derek.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
We have Derek Peterson on the phone for those who are watching from home. And so may I have Mike is going to recuse from this?
Yes.
Okay.
I sit on the board for the Performing Arts Center. So.
Okay.
Should I leave or?
Yeah, why don't you just wait outside for this? And I'll take a motion from Bert or Art or Derek to amend the agenda to move the supplemental appropriation to our first order of business.
I so move.
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Hi.
Okay, that motion carries, and we'll consider the supplemental appropriation request that is being made by the Board of Selectmen. I'm going to turn it over to Maria or Wendy to talk about that.
Good evening. So you may recall in the current year approved capital budget, we do have the project that would be site and accessibility improvements to the Performing Arts Center facility. It was to create accessible parking and to pave the lot down at the facility, as well as to create some accessible sidewalks and pathways leading into the facility, as well as to make the interior essentially ADA accessible. So it's a project a lot of folks, including myself, are quite excited about. This past year, we spent time working, the engineering staff, working with the consultant on design work, preparing cost estimates. And as many things right now, we're seeing COVID inflation, so we have gone out to bid for the project. We did have 5 bids, which again, in this current environment is good because a lot of firms are just so busy, they're not bidding on work. Unfortunately, labor and materials, particularly in this area of work, has just really increased. And so it came in excess of about a little over $170,000 than what we had budgeted. Time is of the essence on this particular project. And that's why we were coming to you as opposed to at your next meeting. So in order to not disrupt the Performing Arts Center, the start of their season, we have a very aggressive construction schedule. And essentially, if we don't begin work by next Tuesday, we miss the window to do this work prior to the season, and we would have to wait until essentially the end of the fall, and we would just love to get this ADA work done before the PAC season begins. So that's why we're here this evening. We were recommending that we use the capital reserve to help with those unanticipated costs. We also had about $14,000 in project savings from the design work that we were recommending to reallocate to help with the inflationary costs.
I'll open it up to questions from the board members.
I have no questions.
Well, just, I heard your summary. So what happened? All the bids came in higher than you thought they would? Is that it?
Yeah, exactly. And we are seeing in certain areas, whether it's labor, materials, supplies, we are just starting to see, again, good cost estimates we had last year during the budget process are no longer good as bids are coming in. And another example is playground equipment and replacement for playground playscapes. We're seeing those come in about 30 to 35% higher. We're seeing vehicles come in about 5% higher. And again, just in the trades, sometimes we're seeing certain projects come in higher. And so again, this was an example of what we believe to be, the inflation impacts that we're seeing on labor and materials.
So there's no other alternative.
Hey, Maria, this is...
Well, Derek, one sec. We'll let Art finish, and then we'll go to you.
I was just going to say, so there's no other alternative that you found if we're going to have this done this summer than to proceed with this extra allocation. Derek, sorry.
Go ahead, Derek.
No, don't apologize, Art. Thank you, and sorry for not being there in person. So I, the $700,000 is the budget is like a 3-line item budget, which I don't. The new budget is a little bit more detailed. How much contingency were we carrying in the original budget?
Derek, that I don't recall off the top of my head. I'd have to go and look. Our town engineer who is managing this project just retired, and I'm sure he would have been able to tell you off the top of his head. With the $700,000, though, we were fortunate. $128,000 was a steep grant that we had received to do that work, with the remaining balance being town funding.
Derek,
Okay.
just in the submission, they do have a 5% contingency listed, which is an industry standard, Maria?
Generally for construction projects, right? So that's the amount that we're including as part of the 870 overall.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. The 5% makes somewhat sense to me. The only caveat there is it really depends on how far out you're talking about beginning the project. So understanding that this is kind of a here and now project, how much of this budget here of the 873 would you say is baked in? Is the materials bought out? How bought out is this project?
Yeah, so this will be a fairly aggressive project. It's a local contractor, Simsbury, that would be performing the work. And again, we're expecting that the work would be completed prior to the start of their season. So it would be happening starting March 15th through about second to third week of May. The project would be complete.
Yeah, the only thought there was that if we feel really good about the 873 and we're here and now, then, I don't know what else we would need a full 5% contingency for, such that, either, there might be a cost overrun or a minor change to the plan or scope. But I would say just in the interest of minimizing the ask as much as possible, that you might want to think about reducing the contingency if these costs are, for the most part, fully baked in. But
yeah, the other thing with this particular,
I'm supportive.
Sorry, Derek.
We'll go to Maria, and then Derek will let you follow up. Maria?
Yeah, I was just going to add that this particular parcel does also involve wetlands and floodplain, so having a little bit of contingency for maybe any potential unanticipated cost does provide a little bit of a greater comfort, and certainly if we don't need the money, we wouldn't, expend it.
And it would then, Derek, we're taking it from the Capital Reserve Fund, so generally, if there is savings, it then goes back into the general Capital Reserve Fund, so it would be a no harm, no foul in that case, if I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah, that would be perfect.
Okay. One of the things our board is going to be considering generally with the budget is we expect to see this multiple times, and I know there's going to be another discussion about this in Latimer in a little bit. So the question is, how are we going to plan for this as a general global issue? And it's not always going to be, it went over, we're just going to pay more. We're going to have to begin to start thinking about how are we going to reduce scope in some areas if it turns out that this is a bigger problem, and we're already seeing in just tonight two issues are coming up. So we can anticipate it's going to be a bigger problem. So the only question I have for you is this a high priority for you? You don't want to reduce the scope in any way, knowing that there are going to be other asks where you may have to reduce scope on other projects. So
again, for myself, and I can't really speak for the full board of selectmen. I think I can just convey what the conversation was at their meeting recently. But this ADA project at that facility is so long overdue, and those accessibility improvements will add so much value to the community that this is a high priority for myself. But I think
I was going to weigh in. I was on aging and disability my first 2 years, and this came up multiple times. When was this going to happen? So seeing it happen now is pretty important.
Yeah. So just for the record, if our clerk can record that the town manager and the first selectman felt that this was a top priority of the Board of Selectmen. Just for the record also, I will say that I did speak with the chair of Aging and Disability to confirm that this was also their priority, and she did confirm that. So with that understanding, with the Derek, if you're comfortable, we'll keep the appropriation ask as presented with the caveat that any savings will then be returned to the Capital Reserve Fund, not to expand the scope. Is that fair? Okay. I'll ask for a motion on that.
Yeah.
What do you say?
I support that.
Okay. Excellent. Then I'll ask for a motion on that.
You want to spend your first money?
Welcome, Bert.
I'll bite the bullet. I will so move.
Okay, is there a second?
I'll second it.
Is there any further discussion? Okay. The motion, just to read for the record, is to move effective March 8th, 2022, to approve a supplemental appropriation for the Performing Arts Center parking and accessibility improvement projects in the amount of $174,000 to be funded using $160,000 from capital reserves and $14,000 from project savings to fund the work. Seeing no additional discussion, all in favor, please say aye.
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 I'll vote for that. The motion passes unanimously, and welcome back, Mike. You can report back to your board now.
They're all watching. Come on.
Thank you for bringing this to us. And yeah, I think that's going to be one of the challenges for the three boards to work together, because we're going to see this over and over and over, and there's not unlimited funds, although we do have ARPA. So we are in a better situation than perhaps in prior years. So we are now ready for the most exciting part of the meeting. We'll turn it over to Matt and Susan for their presentation.
Great, thank you. It is. It's good to be here in person. We were saying before it has been 2 years, so that's kind of hard to fathom. But excited to have an opportunity tonight to just provide an overview. I have a quick stack of slides to go through that I think frame the important main drivers in the budget, and then certainly I know the dialogue in question and answer session is the most important piece. So Amy and I and Susan will be here to answer any questions. And I got members of my team as well, and thank you to my board for coming in a show of support tonight. So with that, we will get it started. Just a couple framing slides to talk about what we value as a Board of Education. So I've mentioned this before. We work under a system of continuous improvement in 4 main Board of Education goals, and I think you'll find as we go through and talk about what our priorities are in this year, they will align pretty coherently with the 4 goal areas that you see up on the presentation board this evening. A little bit about the process. I know there's been interest in that. It was great to see both Lisa and Wendy at our workshop this year, but this is a process that spans quite a bit of time, as I know the town process does as well. And it kicked off with that November-December timeframe meeting, the tri-board meeting this year, the collaboration about what we foresee coming forward in the board of, with the Board of Ed and the Board of Selectmen, a little bit of a fixed cost review. Our building principals and program directors, they develop their building-based budgets and their program-based budgets, and they roll that up to members of central office in the December timeframe, where they present to us individually. They present to myself, Neil Sullivan, and Sue Lemke. We have real good dialogue back and forth about what their priorities are, and then we start to create our presentations for the Board of Ed. And in January, there's 2 main presentations. There's a special education overview report and presentation, and then there's a staffing and enrollment report that Neil kind of spearheads for us. Both those presentations, and I know those materials were provided to you for review in terms of the building blocks of our budget. Then we move into February. We have our workshop, where we really dig into the line items and provide extra data and answer questions that have come up from our board throughout the process. And it kind of culminates on our end with the superintendent's budget, which our board has approved, and I bring it forward to you tonight for discussion. So this is a slide it's interesting, I brought out in our initial presentation in the tri-board meeting when we identified our themes. And we stayed true to that kind of philosophy all the way through in our building blocks, right? And it's really a twofold situation for us this year. It's really looking at the needs of our students and our staff in terms of mental health and clinical supports. What resources do we feel we need to bring forward and advocate for? We've seen challenges there. Nobody's short on hearing about it in the media, and we're not exempt from those challenges, certainly. And then there are learning gaps. You know, we're in the business of teaching and learning, and there's learning gaps to take into account for. So it's those 2 areas of our organization that are the main drivers. And then our conversation was, how can we offset costs, and how can we fund those things and try to minimize the impact to the taxpayer as we do that. We're fortunate to have available to us grant funding that we have not had in the past. We're fortunate to still have that $652,000 in the non-lapsing account to kind of go in as major pieces of the puzzle to offset. So as I go through and I talk about this new staffing, you'll see that none of it actually impacts the fixed cost for the operating budget. We're trying to create a budget where we can respond to the needs in the short term not overwhelm the operating cost, and then we'll present, Amy will work through, an important question is, anytime you use grant funding, you create cliffs, and what do we do to kind of ease that spending in over time? So the budget number, a little north of 77 million, a $2.5 million increase over last year's spending, which equates to 3.47% increase over last year's operating costs.
Matt, just for the public,
Yep.
and we do have new members on our board, can you talk about the non-public school budget? and
Sure.
what-
Sure. The non-public school budget, I don't have the exact number, it's close to $600,000, about $580,000. The main components of that are the Board of Ed is responsible for the transportation costs and the nursing costs for our private schools in our community, should those private schools reach a certain threshold of enrollment. That's the main dollar figure. There's some servicing in there between the town on field maintenance and other smaller costs like that, but it's largely the personnel costs of the nursing services and the transportation costs.
And that's a state mandate.
It's a state mandate, yes. So these are the pieces of the puzzle tonight. Just go through some quick contextual factors that drive our thinking and our planning. Go over the personnel requests that we have in the budget. There's 7 different positions I'd like to just kind of give an overview of. We have other areas due to inflation, due to need, that have increased as well, that we've kind of pinpointed on a slide for you. And then want to spend some time talking about both the grant funding and how we plan to offset those costs. All right.
Could I just ask a question before we get into the weeds on this? We've got some few questions on cliffs and a few other things, but I was on the lead memo, the purpose. From the chair, the statement: the budget adopted by the Board of Education maintains programs, electives, and support services that reflect deep-seated community values. If it had said that seek to educate our youth, that enhance the quality of education, or refer to those 4 priorities or something, but what is the deep-seated community values that is the purpose of this budget?
Well, I think over time, our community has spoken and supported education in a broad standpoint. I think all the boards have. I think there's a value around ensuring that the dollars we spend align with the priorities that the Board of Ed has clearly articulated in their strategic planning. A deep-seated value I can talk about that comes up time and time again is class size, right? We have a strong community value that believes that we need to maintain a reasonable class size to educate our students in an appropriate way. Special education, I believe taking care of the needs of our students in those areas, articulating what those needs are, and then developing programs to meet those needs is a deep-seated value in this community.
I just say I would have been far more comfortable if you'd said things like that, or education. Deep-seated community values, frankly, put a chill in me. I mean, that's language that's used to discuss zoning exclusion, critical race theory. It's inflammatory language in many communities. Deep-seated community values. I mean,
you say deep-seated community values, and you think critical race?
I think, what are we talking about? Yes, that is a language that is used often in zoning. We're going to preserve the character of this town. It is a deep-seated community value, meaning exclusion.
I think, Art, if I can, I think as far as that statement, we're specifically talking about education, not zoning, not anything else. We are only talking about education.
I would have been much more comfortable if you'd said to advance the educational objectives of the Board of Education.
Okay.
I don't know what you mean by deep-seated community value.
I think when you refer to education, it
doesn't.
Okay.
But it's a letter from the chair of the Board of Education, so of course I'm talking about education. I'm presenting you the education budget.
So Susan is telling us what her deep-seated values are, and I think we find them online. Matt, we can find them online with your
core beliefs, our values, our vision of the graduate.
Yeah, so those are posted online, so perhaps,
to me, that's more of a philosophical conversation, Art, about our goals and how we operate, and tonight's a financial conversation.
So we can do that, but that's
And I'd be happy to sit with you and talk through that and talk through the whole 5-year cycle.
I think
how we come to
I understand where you are. I just think the language was very unfortunate.
okay. Point taken. Let's move on.
Okay. So this is just a little background information in terms of where the budget averages have been over the course of the past decade and past 5 years. So a 10-year average of a 1.59% increase and a 5-year average of a 1.75% increase. Really the purpose of this slide I was trying to show is that the boards over time I think have come together to be very effective in maintaining the programs that we value, moving forward initiatives that we feel are important, supporting education, and trying to do it in a way that to the best extent possible minimizes impact to the taxpayer. That's just a bar graph of the same thing. So it's just a snapshot of what that looks like on an annual basis. Enrollment, just a quick snapshot of enrollment, which I think is important to note because over time, particularly the last decade, members that have been on the board are aware that we saw a pretty significant decline in our overall student enrollment. That's certainly one of the main reasons we were able to come in at lower budget numbers. We were able to offset sections, class size, FTE over time by reducing some positions there, thus minimizing the impact. You can see the trend has reversed. These things do go through cycles, and we're back at a time where enrollment is on the rise again. Nothing too significant this year, but we're planning to see an increase of about 27 students overall. You can see horizontally how they're split across the levels. 9-12, a slight decline at the high school, 7-8, pretty static, and an increase at the elementary level of 90 students. We do not plan on adding any elementary teachers, but we were in a position this year, unbudgeted, to add 3 positions to respond to enrollment trends. Thus, we're able to absorb that 90, but it's one of the reasons why we're tighter than most years right now in the current year budget spending. I had this, a different version of this up for the 3-board meeting as well. And really the purpose of this slide is to demonstrate over time, while the overall enrollment has dropped in terms of our student population, students with special needs, our special education population, has actually grown in a different direction. So as we talk tonight, you will see the positions we talk about. They're really with the goal in mind of getting more boots on the ground to work with our varied kids that are struggling in different areas. And I think there's data, significant data to support that over the long haul of what that looks like. It's a student population that's shifted over time. I don't think too differently than other communities have, but certainly we need to respond to those needs.
Matt, you had, and in the workshop, maybe this goes to Sue, did an analysis. It's not just increase in students, but time spent on the needs that has increased.
Yeah, that when we talk about kind of that concept of a caseload of students being, for a special education teacher, different than being a class size of 22 or 24, right? That students can have varied needs in terms of intensity of hours and what their, call it an IEP, their individual education plan, demonstrates the need in terms of service hours that they have. So it's not only an increase in overall numbers, it's an increase in the significance of need as well in a lot of cases. Yeah, good point.
And I just, for those who weren't at the workshop, I don't think it was televised, but Wendy and I did have an opportunity to attend, and the data that the board went through was very extensive. So to the extent that people have questions, the data is there. You can review it. If you have questions, you can talk to Susan or Matt and get that data. But I know I did have the opportunity to review that.
Yep. So to get into the main part of the presentation, which is really the new positions, we did put a slide up on health insurance. You know, at the end of the day, having gone through the process for many years, you know, we're a people business. It's our staff, it's the cost of our benefits. In a normal year, it makes up about 80% of the entire pie of costs. From an insurance standpoint, we're self-insured. We're in good shape. Thankfully, with our internal service fund. I know we have some adjustments that were made over the past couple of years that your board was very involved with in terms of conversation with the various boards, but we really have a healthy state of reserves right now, and that will allow us to offset the projected increase and come in with that line item, which is usually the second largest driver in our budget, to come in flat this year. So that certainly has been helpful with the other needs that are on the table, and I believe the town's going to be in a similar situation on that. I mean, it's a joint situation between the town and the Board of Ed with that fund. And we've used these fund dollars before in the past to do this, and we certainly look at it every year based on where the overall expenditures are to see if it's a good year to try to do that or not do that, and certainly in a favorable situation this year.
And for the public's information, we did bring in our health consultant, Lockton, who went through the analysis of how best to use it and is suggesting a policy for us to consider over the summer. And even with the use of those funds, we are still anticipating reserves at about 26% after that. And our current policy is to have reserves at 20 to 25%, so that still leaves us with a healthy reserve. So in terms of fiscal health, it is a responsible use of that reserve level.
And just for a quick follow-up, just so it's out there, is Lockton is revising their projections, so we should have some revisions soon. As we move into the budget cycle, we have the most recent data as we're starting to put the budget to finalize the touches.
And they're revising those revisions to the good?
Depends on claims experience. Okay. Keep you posted.
Never-ending story. So we've divided up these two next slides in terms of elementary staffing requests and then secondary staffing requests. So you can see that we are advocating for 2 social workers across our elementary schools. So we're looking to create more or less of a new model, a model where we have 1 social worker in each of our elementary schools. We currently have 3 split across the 5, and we're finding with the needs of our students, the support we need to provide our families, that this is work that needs to be done in real time, and if you're at the wrong building, it can't really wait until you get there at noon the next day. It's really been interesting conversation. There's legislation in right now, I believe, that may be offering districts more funding to support mental health supports in their home districts. I don't know where that will land, but that's something for us to certainly keep an eye on. This was the #1 priority of each and every one of our building principals when they came in for their presentations. So we really feel that we can make a positive impact by creating that new model. And as you'll see later on, we're having conversations certainly now with the town side and the Board of Selectmen about potentially funding these 2 positions through the town ARPA funding. So I have a slide that will encapsulate that later.
Matt, before you move on from that, 2 things, because it's been in the CT Mirror and other things. A lot of people don't understand the role of social workers as compared to
psychologists?
Yeah, so if you could just talk to that. And also, we had submitted questions in advance to you, and one of the questions our board had asked of Matt and Susan was, what is the standard ratio of social workers to school? And it's actually 1 to 250, and Simsbury's ratio, when we add this, will be 1 to 480. So it doesn't even get us to exactly where we need to be. But
it doesn't, and that was good conversation that came up at our board level. And the way we look at that is we're also fortunate to already be well-staffed with school psychologists. I mean, we are looking to add 1 at the secondary level, you'll see, and we really look at those 2 resources working in tandem. So we actually think we'll be in pretty good shape to balance the needs. It's not a direct caseload comparison, to your point, but the way that we've built those teams over time, we think it'll be sufficient resource. School psychologists are responsible much more for the testing end of students and the evaluation end of the students. The social workers much more along like the problem solving, really working with families, working with students on behavior plans, putting things in place, what kind of supports and plans do we need to put in place in the classroom and maybe even at the home in kind of a collaborative way to ensure that there's success moving forward. Psychologist a little bit more on the technical clinical side, social worker a little bit more on the collaborative problem solving side. The leadership structure, give you a little background on that. We're looking to, at our elementary level, create a new model to support special education services. At the secondary level, so when you look at our middle school, we have a department supervisor in special education. So it's not an administrative position, it sits in the teacher union. However, it has a lot of leadership tendencies and it has a stipend to it. So one of the main responsibilities of department supervisors is to facilitate the many planning and placement team meetings that are run at the schools to go over the students' learning plans, collaborate with the parents. It's a very collaborative approach. It takes up a significant amount of time. Our school psychologists currently run and facilitate those meetings at the elementary level. So one of the real goals behind putting this position in place, and with this one addition, it'll actually create 3 because we have retirements and so forth that we're reallocating for the other 2. It will free up our school psychologist for the assessments, for the testing, and for other work of working with kids. So again, our philosophy behind each and every one of these positions is to free up resources to work more closely with kids. So what we actually did is we took a position, which was a central office position, that was responsible for elementary education for all 5 elementary schools, and it just was not as an effective model because the person couldn't be everywhere, and we're choosing to create more of a building-based approach with 3 positions across the 5 buildings.
It's 3 positions, but 1 full-time equivalent?
No, it'll be 3 full-time equivalents, but only impact of 1 to the budget, Art.
I see.
Because we have 2 retirements of leadership positions within the district that we're just going to change.
I see.
Good question. A special education teacher. Caseload sizes, needs of students. We've seen an increase of population at Squadron Line and Latimer Lane in both the general ed population, but also the special needs population, and we need to add a half-time teacher to each of those. There are already half-time teachers there. We'll look to expand those roles to full-time, so it's the equivalent of 1 full-time position. And then a speech and language pathologist. This is really an area we've seen tremendous growth in our preschool program of students coming in with much more intensive speech and language needs. We need to get on that and support that early, and it's just really a number of students versus a number of staff situation right now. So a full-time equivalent speech and language pathologist. And at the secondary level, we have 2 requests. The first is a 1.0 teaching position. It's capstone support. And not to get too deep into it, I know we provided some rationale in the support materials, but the capstone requirement is a new learning experience that is required for every high school student starting next year. So it's a graduation requirement. It's a mandated requirement. So for Simsbury High School, you think right now the cohort size is about 350. Every one of these students starting next year needs to take a course or have an experience that meets the requirement of the capstone. It's actually pretty cool philosophically in what it is. It's much more project-based. It can be an internship. It can be an interest area. But just from sheer volume, we need somebody to support the lane. We have an individual who's done a great job, Liz McKay, in building kind of the framework for this. We brought her on board a couple years ago, and now as the rubber hits the road, she needs a partner to help both teach some of these classes, capstone classes, and help kids with internships and manage this. So this will be a little fluid over time in terms of which lanes kids choose to go into and how we manage it, but definitely needed to upfront this with resource, knowing it's going to be a requirement next year. The school psychologist, is to split between the high school and Henry James, and it's a matter of increased evaluations. Evaluations come in 2 ways, right? They come from our staff working with students and identifying concerns and thinking we should do some testing, and they come from parents who have concerns, and then we're legally required to take a look at those evaluations as well. So,
Matt, you have an acronym there for ESSER. Can you just explain what that is?
So I'm going to have to lean on Neil on this one, but this is the federal funded grant. I'm not exactly sure.
Elementary and secondary.
Come on, you knew it.
I did know it.
Education Relief Grant, I believe.
We'll go with that.
It's the Board of Ed's version of ARPA.
Yes.
There we go. That's all I need.
I should have had that at the ready.
And ARPA is...
First thing Mike said when I came in is there's a lot of acronyms.
Well, one of the things we're finding, especially with Bert and Mike being new, and I'm sure other members of the Board of Selectmen, is that we use a lot of acronyms.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And to the extent we can all remember to... If we don't know what they are, there's probably members of the public who don't either.
Elementary and secondary schools emergency relief fund.
There you go.
Thank you. Very exciting.
All right, so the next slide kind of rolls up the personnel costs. So as I've said, it's the largest piece of the puzzle. So the first 6 to 7 items here are contractual, and just wanted to show you what that roll-up looks like. So those are the dollar figures over what last year's line item was, and the percentage represents that increase comparative to the overall operating budget. So you can see the first line item, for example, is our teacher contract, by far and away, with close to 400 certified teachers, our largest driver in the budget. We put the cost of the positions I just talked about in here. It's about 3/4 of the way down on the top. It says impact of new position 6 FTE. It doesn't have the 7th FTE because we plan to absorb one of those FTE into our contracted services line item that we already have without asking for an increase in that line item. But you can see that the cost of those positions is a little over $500,000 or a 0.73% increase to the overall budget. So it's a really significant driver. And when you roll that up just over last year's cost, you're looking at almost a 5% increase. So the bottom part of this sheet is how do we kind of reduce that number and get it in a more palpable place. So the insurance being flat doesn't reduce the number, but certainly helps. We had some significant savings in the pension and OPEB line item because of the adjustments we made. I think it was last year in the mortality tables. It was a one-time move that cost significant dollars, right thing to do at the time, but we benefit from it this year.
And Matt, that includes the 6.5 pension investment assumption?
Yes. Okay. Yep. And then we take the grants right back out in terms of showing you what we would put on the grant funding. There's projected retirement savings. So let me talk through that because we have a couple new board members. So the way we get that figure is we have 6 teacher retirements already. So what we look at is the outgoing cost of a high-level teacher with a replacement hire at a mid-level contract, and we just kind of ballpark $25,000 of savings. It's a figure we monitor throughout the year, so that's where we get the $150,000. And kind of when you work everything through there, we're able to knock off about 1.74 and come in at a personnel cost closer to 3 than closer to 5.
And with the projected savings from certified retirements, when our board has talked about budgeting the vacancy rate, that's kind of what we mean.
Yeah. So some of the other main needs that came up throughout, and this was really discussed at length at our workshop, an increase in textbooks and instructional supplies of about $48,000. So what we identified there actually is it's one item. It's consumables for our elementary math program. And what we were doing on an annual basis was pre-buy-in, seeing if we could do it the year before, but never really actually truing up that budget line item in terms to what that cost was really being reflected. And Amy doesn't want to let me do that anymore, so we're putting
Bert
in.
didn't give me the manual. I guess got to include it in the year belongs.
No, but I think it makes sense, and we you know, move it towards instructional supplies as a consumable. Slight increase in equipment. Software costs have really increased over time. When we met with Maggie Seidel, our Director of Instructional Technology, it's a little bit twofold. It's lessons learned from when we went online for the better part of the year and new technologies and software packages that were out there that were free at the time. Everything was free.
Right.
But really some great tools that teachers didn't want to let go of. So really streamlining what we're using and accounting for the inflation there. A $40,000 kind of placeholder, right, Amy, for inflationary costs across the entire budget in terms of trying to create a bit of a contingency. The transportation's a pretty significant increase. That is a $2 million line item overall in the budget. It represents what we think will probably be about a 3% increase to re-up the contract this year. But more importantly, there's been a significant shortage of drivers. Salters, as wonderful as they are, and we have been able to hold true for major transportation through. Special needs transportation, we've had to go to outside contracting more frequently. Activities and sports, we've had to go to outside activities lately. Those costs have gone up, and it's really put a strain on us this year, so we need to budget that accurately. They don't see a true end to that driver shortage and that driver issue right now, so it may be something we're juggling over the next couple of years.
Matt, are you concerned at all with what's going on in the Ukraine and the price of gas? Is that going to impact this line item?
It could. I mean, we had the fuel that we costed out collectively with Tom. I think we put a 7% on it, but it's definitely something we're going to have to monitor over time. The other is utilities. Utility cost that was up, and Tom Roy did a nice job with the background of, I think it was a 5% increase that both the town and the board went in on in terms of joint costs. So this is really the other piece of the puzzle. We have the 3% personnel cost, or almost 3%, and then we have the 0.5% of these additional costs and line items. So it's not an enormous number of line items that are going up significantly, but it does add up in order of magnitude. So you put those two together, and that gives us right around the element of that 3.47. So this is just a snapshot of some early thinking of how we feel we would like to fund these positions. Certainly the top piece is collaborative with the town, and as we move through, we need to continue to talk about that. The other are funding sources from ARPA funding from the Board of Ed, and then the ESSER funding that we talked about. The one position of Capstone Coordinator, and Lisa, you had asked a good question. We wanted to use some of the non-lapsing funding year one, so it didn't hit operating on that, and your question was how long would you want to fund that from non-lapsing? That's a position we think it would be 1 year fund from non-lapsing, and we would absorb that either with retirements the next year or with a reduction maybe somewhere in enrollment at the secondary level. So we don't see the non-lapsing account as a place where we would put staffing dollars continuously. I don't think it's a good use of the fund.
And just for the public and for our new members, the non-lapsing fund is?
Yep, so the non-lapsing fund was created, I can't remember, Lisa, eight years ago or so maybe, because we were together on that, where legislation was passed where you can hold up to 2% of any dollars that are unexpended on the Board of Ed side, hold them in an account that's pretty much a joint account of the Board of Ed and the Board of Finance to use for agreed upon emergencies, agreed upon priorities, whatever it might be on an annual basis. So right now we have $652,000 in that account. This is one use we think would be appropriate. Amy, in a second, I'm going to give her the key. She's going to talk about how we plan to kind of feather in that cliff over time, and we think that the non-lapsing account could be a good use of the funds for that.
Can I just move you back for a second to the expense items, because the single largest source of increase I noticed was negotiated agreements for the staff.
Yes.
And that's over 2%, which means by itself it's an increase that's about as large as any increase we've had for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
So I'm new to this process.
Yes.
Could you explain that a little bit, or at least elaborate on how that comes to pass?
Sure. So I'll work through, I guess, the teacher's contract because it's the largest one, right? So, the contracts are collectively bargained on a 3-year, teachers on a 3-year annual basis. We're working into our 3rd year, so the fixed cost in the 3rd year was the highest of the costs that we've had in there. And really what you're getting is market at the time. I mean, we do go through a good faith process, but it's really based on the comparatives that are out there, and the realities are of if you don't come to agreement and go to an arbitration type situation, what you're going to get is what the market yields. These are certainly costs as we think about going forward in new contracts they're going up like the cost of everything else. One thing that's made that cost a little bit higher this year on the teacher side is the 3 positions that were not budgeted for. There were 3 teacher positions. So you're talking about a placeholder of almost over $90,000 times 3 that wasn't budgeted for, that inflate that overall percentage beyond what the actual fixed contract cost is, that get rolled into the next year.
And Matt, there is a minor role for the Board of Finance to play in your negotiations. I think the Connecticut general statutes, before they begin their negotiations, they do come in and do an executive session with us and go through the details of what they anticipate they're going to face, and we'll have an opportunity to ask questions in executive session. So encourage executive session questions on this.
And it's a negotiating year, so I'll be here this summer for that meeting.
Okay.
Which will be important, yeah. because you are seeing early settlements on the teacher side coming in quite a bit higher than they had in past years, where your average, general wage was under 2, maybe with a little bit of the step increase over 2, but you're seeing in the 3s and then sometimes even in the 4s right now. So definitely going to require some conversation.
Hey, Matt, it's Derek on the phone here. Sorry to interrupt the conversation, but just a couple questions on the utilization of grant funding. We talked about the non-lapsing account, funding that for the Capstone coordinator for a year. Tell me how long the ESSER funding how many years would the ESSER funding support the school psychologist as well as the department supervisor? And then second question, the 2 leadership positions, are they not being backfilled by either existing or from outside, such that this would truly be a net 7? I'm sorry, a net 5 as opposed to a total of 7 new positions.
So you're talking about a net 5 in terms of cost, Derek?
Yeah. I'm wondering if the 2 leadership positions will be either people promoted to those leadership positions, or are they going away?
Yeah. So you're talking about the department supervisor positions, correct? Okay. So there's 3 total. One is a shift of an FTE, basically, Derek, from an administrative position in the union, an elimination of that, which frees up those dollars to be allocated on a teacher FTE. The other is a retirement of a position at the elementary level that we're going to utilize that FTE for a department supervisor position.
Okay.
Does that get at that?
Yeah. So Matt.
Yeah, but and maybe I'm confusing, but again, the ESSER funding is that sustainable, or will that come back to us as an FTE?
Right. So that's
next year.
That's something in. This is my suggestion. Let's do this next slide, because Amy has a slide, Derek. She wants to walk through the ideas on what to do with the cliff. Because the ARPA funding for the town has a longer span than the ESSER funding for the Board of Ed, which is only a year out from now, if that's your question.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's my question.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes. So I'm going to turn this to Amy to the next 2 slides. 2. I think you have the last one too, right?
Fancy.
It's fancy.
Okay, so as you can see at the top of the slide, we have the fiscal year 23 proposed net budget, and that's what you'll see in your budget books. And then we have the one-time grant funding of about $568,000, which gets us to our gross budget of a little under $77,600,000. So if we were going to put all of our positions into our budget, our real number is actually that gross budget number of the 77, almost 6. So what are we going to do to kind of feather in that increase over the next several years? So the proposal is obviously down there. You'll see fiscal year 23 to start. We're going to use the grant funding, and our budget is only going to be a shy over $77 million. In fiscal year 24, we're going to take that same budget, and then we're going to do an operating budget phase-in of about $215,000, which is about a 0.2% increase that we're going to commit to. And then we're going to utilize the non-lapsing to offset the remainder of the variance, getting us back to that gross budget number that we need to get to recoup all of the funds. In fiscal year 25, we're going to take a similar approach. We're again going to build in the $215,000 from the operating budget. We're going to utilize some of our non-lapsing and get to the true-up budget number. And then fiscal year 26, we will build in the last $138,000 into our operating, and then we're made whole over the next 3 years. So a couple of reasons why we picked this approach is best practice is always to use your restricted funding first, which is your grant funding, either due to time or purpose restrictions. So we have the COVID-related grant funds, and just in their nature and how they were given to the boards and the restrictions that are put on them, their intended use is exactly what's being proposed here. And then lastly, the Board of Finance had expressed an interest in seeing utilization of those non-lapsing funds because they have been sitting there for years. So between the intent of the grant, the restrictions on the grant, and the Board of Finance's interest that they've expressed previously, we're checking all the boxes with this phased-in approach to address the cliff long-term. And then there's still some room within our operating budget too. Fiscal year 26, there's a little bit of room that we do have at the end of fiscal year 26. I believe our non-lapsing balance, I meant to write it down, I believe it's about 65,000 or so. And then we have some special ed grant funding around 60,000. So we have a little bit of money to play around with if this doesn't come to fruition, because we don't know what's going to happen in the out years. So we do still have a little bit of wiggle room to play around with if not everything comes to plan exactly as we see it.
Matt, one question I have for you, the capstone, is that going to be a permanent position or does that come and go?
Yeah, so, I mean, I don't want to give you a loose answer. I think it's something we really need to monitor over time, because there are 3 different lanes that students can take to meet this requirement. There are some courses already, some of our interest area courses like Project Lead the Way courses that meet that requirement, so you can take that course, doesn't require additional staffing. But then there are areas where I have a personal interest, I want to research, I want to create that project. I need a class, it's called a capstone class, to help a teacher help facilitate that. So those will be class sections. And then there's the internship component. We're going to have to see, Lisa, where people go with this. One option is it's permanent in the structure. Another is they start going to certain lanes and your regular course requirements or you build new courses can absorb those opportunities for kids. So it's really one we're going to have to kind of monitor.
But do you feel like the other ones that are being funded through ESSER and ARPA, through the grants, those are likely to be permanent, I
think definitely multi-year.
Yeah.
I think we're just discovering now what some of the challenges are with our students, and we're trying to align the programming to meet those needs. But it's quite a bit of resource. To your point, I think it comes back for evaluation of, we know it's been brought on by certain circumstances. As those circumstances improve and performance improves, I think we take a look. But certainly multi-year. I don't see this coming in with social workers and a school psychologist for a year and saying, hey, we figured this thing out and we're in good shape.
So one of the questions the Board of Finance will have, obviously it's a policy call on the Board of Ed to determine what resources they need, but one of the things we can do is how do you fund those resources? Right. And one of the options that our board may consider, but perhaps not, is I would at least like Amy to evaluate whether we should, especially depending on what happens with Wendy's budget, if they come in under budget, we may be able to incorporate some of the money in the operating budget phase in the current year, right. Take a holiday next year when we have a debt service peak,
yeah.
And just flip those 2 funding years just to help with the
yeah.
And when I talk about the peak, next year Latimer's debt service hits the budgets. When you approve a project, it hits 2 years later, and we're expecting an increase in debt service about $1.5 million. I mean, $1.6 million, not $1.5.
Yeah, so we had talked about that a little bit.
So,
and to me, that's the night we pull out that worksheet.
That's
when
we
pull
do
the
it.
levers,
yes.
Right? You see what the actual impact is of moving the pieces of the puzzle and what that does. So we did that a few years ago with OPEB.
Precisely.
And then we presented at the town meeting and the rationale for why the number looked different than what the Board of Ed approved, and the Board of Finance said that was at their recommendation. So there's definitely a track record of being able to get there if people collectively think that's the best way to pay for things.
So that's one of the things when, from a Board of Finance perspective, we look at, okay, what needs to be funded and what buckets do we have to fund it with? And so it's not necessarily about eliminating a position, but perhaps using a different bucket at a different point in time.
Can I just point of clarification? And back to Amy's comments, the one-time grant funding, that is 100% ARPA, correct?
No.
And the proposed CLIF funding?
The one-time grant funding is a combination. So we have some ARPA funding, or ESSER in this case, that is more generalized, and then we have some funding that is strictly for special education, and then we have some additional COVID funding, I don't know off the top of my head, for like stipends or something to that effect. So it's a combination of grants. It's not just the ESSER grant.
But they all have the same shelf life.
Just to clarify, some of that needs to be used for its specified reasons. ARPA does not. So what percentage of the one-time grant funding is ARPA?
Well, so the town ARPA funding, which I think you're referring to without the restrictions, is for the social workers, but the board ARPA funding or the ESSER funding is restricted.
And it's more limited, Derek. It has to be used sooner than the town's ARPA. So you can't delay it that long or you lose it.
Right.
So is there any town ARPA, unrestricted town ARPA in that one-time grant funding?
No, that's all the board's money. Yeah.
Okay.
Open it up to Bert and Art on this section on the cliffs. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot Mike. Mike's I'll start with Mike.
I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm looking at this and I forgot you were there.
Stealth mode.
They moved him closer.
Yeah, you're far away. Does anyone have any questions on the cliff?
No, I don't have a question.
Not questions on them, I just recognize they're there, and we're going to have to talk about them.
Yeah. So I think one of the challenges we have generally in the town is there are unprecedented needs and there are unprecedented dollars. And how do we manage the needs, the dollars, and the long-term fiscal health of the town? And that's where moving levers and pulling buckets and where we really rely on Amy to give us options about which buckets we can use at what points in time to meet the needs that we've identified. I don't think anyone who's been reading the paper isn't aware of the mental health needs that are out there right now. I was hoping we could turn to capital for a little.
One more slide.
Sorry.
All right.
I made Matthew include this one too.
Yes.
Okay.
So,
Matthew. Amy and my mother, that's it.
I can't help it. So this is the fiscal year 23 budget, which is great. But as we were putting together the fiscal year 23 budget, we put together our fiscal year 22 projections. And as our accountant is doing that for your budget book, we found some deficit. Oh, I'm sorry. We found some deficits that are kind of in accordance with what we're seeing in fiscal year 23. So we're seeing some of the same trends in fiscal year 22 that were already identified during the budget process in fiscal year 23. So as you can see from the slide, when we put our projections together, we're anticipating a deficit of about $575,000. This is something that we saw last year as well with all of the COVID, and we were able to cover it. So this is just a heads up at this point. $180,000 related to the 3 teachers that Matthew talked about and that he walked you through, I think at the tri-board that he gave you a heads up at. So $180,000 we weren't able to cover. $230,000 relates to that special education, those social emotional supports that are in your budget book for the special education presentation. And then $160,000 we're seeing due to the transportation of the driver shortage related to special education and athletics. So just like last year, same things that we're doing this year to address the possible deficit, hiring freeze. And we're also taking a more detailed analysis into our larger accounts. We have over 670 accounts on the board side. And so some of those larger accounts we just didn't have time to dig into before tonight. And then the directors and the principals are all reviewing their budgets for possible capacity. So we'll come back to that, see how much of our deficit that we can cover. And then we might have to have a conversation closer to year end to see what that really looks like. So right now, monitoring and trying to get a more concise number for any possible deficits at year end.
So to your point, Lisa, this is one of those areas as well. We present a plan on the cliff. We have those dollars. What's the best way if this problem persists to use those dollars? I mean, we're in a good position with the overall reserve dollars, but it's creating the plan and getting an agreement on what the best place to use them is.
Yeah, and the other thing we're seeing this year, which we haven't seen in many years, is unprecedented needs that are new. So how do you balance and meet the needs in the immediacy of the moment.
The $230,000 kind of projected short gap on the special education is an interesting one because it correlates directly to your needs and our inability to hire people in those areas at this time due to shortages. So you contract out with consultant companies to come in and help you in the short term at a higher cost. So it's just a difficult challenge right now when we have to get at certain things to problem solve without the real labor force out there to meet the needs.
So first of all, thank you for bringing that to our attention. The sooner we know about it, the more we can think about which buckets to pull from. We actually do plan for this situation. When people always say to us, why do you budget the tax collection rate at 98.5? Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly why we do it. That's one of the tools we have. It means you won't be able to put it into capital reserves or perhaps other things, but that is one of the tools we have because these things do happen periodically. So that is one of the rationales. We get asked that question every year, and this is precisely one.
So that's a wrap on this piece. Now I was going to have Jason come up and work through year one capital.
Great.
And talk about the other topic that you had brought up before this.
Okay.
Okay? Yeah.
Thank you.
Where's the clicker?
Me.
All right. So the capital projects that we're looking at this year involve some plumbing improvements, electrical improvements, and roof replacements. So the plumbing and electrical are at our two schools that were built in the 1950s. The roof replacements we keep on a 20-year replacement schedule. Every other year, we've been improving our network infrastructure with a fixed amount. And we're also looking to replace the modulars at Terrafil that were built originally in 1984. And then finally, we have some climate control improvements, improving air quality at multiple schools. And we can just hit the next. And these are the dollars that are associated with that. So the plumbing improvements at Tooten Hills, we're looking for $480,000 at Central School. Some of the electrical service there is extremely old wiring, literally from the 1950s, at $250,000. The two roof replacements, we're estimating at $370,000 for Central. These are portions of the roof, so the roofs are contained in different vintages. So specifically vintage 3 at Central and 1 and 2 at Terrafil. And then the $350,000 allocated for the 84 modular replacements. And then lastly, the district-wide items, improving climate control. We're looking for $1.65 million on that, of which 1.2 would be ARPA funded. And then finally, the $400,000 that we've looked at every other year for the network improvements.
So I'd ask you, I know we've sent this to you in advance and our board has received a response on this, but for the public, one of the things about the American Rescue Plan Act is that we have been told from the Treasury that one of the priorities is being super communicative on how the money is being spent, and you did provide that to our board, but I wonder if you could just share that publicly. And I would ask you to submit a new form so that the public can review it as it gets closer to approvals.
Sure. Yes, so the bulk of that funding would be towards the high school improvements. So we've done an engineering study. We've received the study back, and we're right now looking at the different options that it presents and looking at the dollars for those options. So the spaces include third floor classrooms, the band and choral rooms, the auditorium, a gymnasium. This would be looking at dedicated outdoor air systems. We're looking to improve the air quality with fresh air improvements. And then VRF units for cooling, basically split system units to actually cool the air.
And we got this from our master plan. I shouldn't use the word master plan. I'm guilty of this as well. Our long-term plan. Is that where this is from?
Yeah, that's been driving all of our capital plans since the study came through, and we've been adjusting for inflation and looking at material availabilities. I suspect for the roofing projects, funding them this year would mean material availability, at least in the roofing materials, for not this summer, but the following. We did a very similar concept for the high school roof this past summer, where it was the previous year's budget that funded it. That project was done that way out of an abundance of caution to make sure that the project was complete for school to start on time. It's a very large project, and summers seem to get shorter and shorter as we go. In this case, one of the things we learned during that roofing project from the architect was exactly how lucky we were in that the materials that we had purchased, that we had managed to bring on site and store ahead of time were many months out had we not pulled the trigger when we did.
VRF, excuse me, I'm sure others know what that means. What is the VRF expenditure?
It refers to variant refrigerant.
Vintage roof, I think.
Yeah, it's basically the cooling system, split system cooling unit.
Ah, it's different. So it's not the vintage roof in Central School.
No, it's
okay.
Variant refrigerant flow,
Okay.
I believe.
Is that different from air conditioning?
So,
It's
question,
it's air conditioning, but it means it's
One
not
sec,
the
Derek.
unit in the window, is what we're talking.
We'll turn to Derek, please.
Yeah.
oh, thanks, Lisa. I'm sorry, I don't know who's presenting the capital budget, but I'm curious, and this will be a consistent theme for me. You did talk about availability of materials, and where lumber has been all over the map. Or do these roof figures contemplate a full tear off and redo, or just levels of coating?
It's a tear off and redo, but in sections, not the entire buildings.
Right. So lumber would be a part of those replacements. Is that correct?
Correct.
So when were these numbers estimated, and what kind of escalators do you have on them for inflation as you described?
Originally estimated in 2020, and since then they've been upped over the years, and most recently, so now they're at, I'd say, 35% higher than they originally were.
Jason, do these?
Yeah. Okay.
Would
so
you?
I wouldn't put and again I think that this $4.5 million capital project, given 2020 numbers, which are basically, in my estimation, I'm not trying to be glib here, but meaningless, because costs have run a lot more than 5% over a 2-year span. So I'm just saying, from an overall cost standpoint, we're seeing this already, in construction budgets, or that were, estimated or budgeted, almost a year ago for Latimer. Huge budget bust there. I would expect the same here for numbers that are, for the most part, stale.
On the roofing side, it was at 35%. The others, the electrical work at Central was through an electrician's quote that was very recent, about 2 months ago. The modulars is also an estimate that came in relatively recently. And the water distribution systems has a lot of moving parts to it. For that amount, we're looking at changing the scope if need be, but that was also up since the original numbers. And then similarly, the district network infrastructure piece was very recent quotes. And as I say, the climate study, we're still looking at the different options within that, but these are our numbers that the engineers are projecting out for the year that we're doing them.
So I guess the question where Derek is asking, our whole board is asking, and I think Amy had mentioned that she felt that these were confident to reflect the current state of the economy. Is that accurate?
That's accurate.
Yeah, I think he was saying that these projections started in 20, but the current year escalator is the 35%. It's not 35% from 20. I think that's where the confusion came in.
So it incorporates the concern we have. You've already baked that in.
Correct.
Okay.
And then just an overall comment in terms of availability. If, for example, we're budgeting this year for something that we would have expected to spend in, let's say, September, October, and can't end up getting the project started until March or April of next year, just generally, I would say that it might make sense, given where costs are at their absolute height, wages at their absolute height, that we may end up, from a timing perspective, want to push those projects that are bumping up against the next budget cycle at a point where there might actually be cost savings and less supply chain disruption and more availability of materials. So that's something that I'll be thinking about as each of these projects kind of comes before us, is what is the timing of those projects?
Understood.
Do you have a question? So one question. One of the things that always challenges our board is when we see a capital thing, we know there's going to be increased electricity spent because you're doing increased things, and they're showing zero impact on the out years in the operating budget. What is a good way, what resources do we need to get those projections in there so that we can start planning our understanding of the true impact, I guess?
It's difficult to say without knowing exactly what it is we're building in with the air quality pieces. Once we know which spaces we're cooling, we'll be working with the engineers to determine what the actual spend will be.
So I understand that. So I guess there's no way to project that. We do know that there's going to be an operating impact for these things, right? And we have no idea what it's going to be. Do we have a range? How would we get a range, sort of? Is that something the engineers could get for us?
Yeah, that's going to be part of the conversation.
Okay, and when you get that, can you report back to us on that?
Sure.
Okay, perfect.
I don't understand. Did you say we don't know which spaces we're going to be cooling?
We've received an engineering study that looked at many spaces. To do them all wouldn't be feasible in the amount of money we're looking at now.
see.
So it's going back and forth with the engineers to say, do this, not that.
But they are going to come back with a more detailed sheet talking about the options that they're, and the priorities that they're going to look at so that the public can understand that.
Correct.
Here are the options that are being considered. Here's how they're going to be prioritized, and depending on how the financing works, we'll get as much done as we can. And then the rest then get
But
put in.
To that point, Lisa, did I hear that there were comments made as to capital needs at the high school as well?
Not beyond the cooling piece.
Just the cooling there.
Okay.
For the current year. Okay, are there any other questions before we turn to Latimer on the capital projects? So just for the members of the public, the way a capital budget works is recommendations are made by Matt and his team to the Board of Ed. The Board of Ed then makes recommendations to, in consultation with the town manager, make recommendations to the Board of Selectmen. The Board of Selectmen actually has ownership of the entire capital budget for the town, and so they'll vote on all the needs, looking at Board of Ed and every other department, and then it comes to the Board of Finance to evaluate those needs, and the Board of Finance is actually not the final determinator either. We then recommend a budget to the people, and it's through referendum that these projects finally get approved, unless they're done mid-year through supplemental appropriations. And before we go on, I just want to talk a little bit about how supplemental appropriations work, because we're going to start seeing a lot of them. We're already seeing more than we've ever in our history. And the way you appropriate money, just for members of the public, if you just bear with me for a second, an appropriation is a political act. It's what elected officials vote on to say, hey, this is what you can spend money. Once the money is voted on by the political bodies, then it goes to staff to spend the money. That's the expenditures. So in Simsbury, our appropriation works two ways. We do it primarily through the budget, where everybody makes recommendations to the Board of Finance. The Board of Finance then forwards a budget and an appropriation, permission to spend, to the public who votes on it, and that becomes the formal appropriation. What we're starting to see this year, and we're going to see a lot of it because of the American Rescue Fund and because of unprecedented needs, are supplemental appropriations. So you have the main appropriation. You want to do it as much as possible during the budget process because that's where people vote. But in extraordinary times that we are living in and that we're seeing, you do something called a supplemental appropriation. And that's something that comes up mid-year that wasn't planned for. And we need to spend more than what the voters approved. And the way that works is it goes to the Board of Selectmen to say, hey, we need to spend more. They recommend to the Board of Finance, and then the Board of Finance can approve it if it's under 2% of the total operating budget. If it's over 2%, we'll go to referendum. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is there may be a need for this in some of our capital needs, especially with Latimer. So just in terms of the process, how that would work. And it's super complicated, and we're working through it, but to the extent we can, we're going to try and be as transparent and open, and especially with supplemental appropriations, we're probably going to ask for more detail because the public doesn't get to vote on those. So why don't you, with that roll up, why don't we talk about Latimer?
Sure.
Sorry, Lisa, are we done with the slide presentation then, or is?
Yes.
I mean, if we have any questions related to the slide presentation, should I ask it now, or make a comment now?
Yes.
I guess the comment would be, I'm not excited about spending one-time funding on our largest line item in our budget, because every position created is in itself a cliff, even if it's one position in perpetuity. So I'm not supportive of spending ARPA money or any one-time funding on the OpEx budget or something that's recurring. I think the capital improvements budget here, I'm not saying in its entirety, but much happier to spend money here on one-time capital improvements vis-a-vis a one-time grant. So the question I have really focuses around the positions that you're adding as in social workers specifically, because as it was discussed prior to this meeting, my understanding was that this was related to the pandemic, heightened emotional stress. So while I might be convinced that we need that, although I find it unusual that 2 years after the pandemic started, we're talking about this, not in 2020, not in 2021, but now that we have ARPA money, we're talking about it in 2022, notwithstanding there may be lingering effects. For all intents and purposes, this is now an endemic, and people are learning how to live with it in their daily lives. So maybe you could talk to me a little bit about why now?
Sure. So I think last year's budget, when we presented, Derek, it was really about reallocating the resources that we had taken away from kids to teach classes online. So our focus was pulling those resources back and rebuilding our intervention programs from an academic standpoint. So that was really, when you go back and look at that budget, there was a huge shift in FTE to do that. And this year, quite honestly, we're seeing much more significant behavior upticks because now we are back together in a much different way than we were last year. So I think the timing of the reintegration into the school communities and the behaviors we're seeing and the supports that kids need, actually a little bit counter to what you're saying, in all honesty, time up perfectly with the requests.
So Matt, one of the questions following up on what Derek said is, if we use the ARPA money, Town American Rescue Plan Act money, for the social workers, and those are temporary positions, it makes sense to use the ARPA money. But if you come in and tell us, no, I think these are going to be permanent positions, depending on what Wendy does, it may make more sense to feather them into the operating budget this year. And then that frees up some of the ARPA, to Derek's point, for some capital needs.
And I understand that, and I think we hit on that before. So at the end of the day, these are our needs. I'm more than happy to continue to talk about why we feel there are needs. We have grant funding that we can make the decision on how we want to utilize it. If the Board of Finance wants to actually add to the operating costs, that's a decision you can make.
Right.
So we have different kind of lanes we need to work here through, but I don't think it's up for conversation to talk about do we need them or not, and not that anybody has suggested that. It's how we fund it. I think I tried to demonstrate, if you put these resources in, it's a 5% increase. I mean, if that's something that people are comfortable with, that's a different conversation.
So we won't know that until we see what the Board of Selectmen
Right.
comes through. So we'll look at, but that's one of the evaluations we're going to look at. What is the tax increase? Can we add those positions without raising taxes? And the initial presentation from Maria is, yes, you can, depending on what the Board of Selectmen adds in. So we'll have to sort of see how that plays out. But that's one of the things our board is going to be looking at, not about whether the position is needed, but when to integrate it into the operating budget and when it makes sense.
Derek, I completely understand your point. We've had these conversations over the years, right? The grants are usually not the first place you want to go for personnel costs. Totally understand that.
Right. Yeah, it's simply a matter of how it's funded from my perspective.
Yeah.
So.
All right, so we'll look into that.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
You ready now, Derek, for Latimer?
I am.
Okay.
For sure.
Okay. So at the start of our Latimer project, our architect put together the design, the plan, and the budget that he expected to have for this. Built into that, of course, was some degree of contingency, although what we've seen has been unprecedented in terms of the way these costs have changed. The next step in this is that we bring in a construction manager, and the construction manager looks into phasing and then also audits that budget. And we are right now in the process of finding what the construction manager is seeing out in the market for purchasing the types of materials they need. We don't have that figure reconciled yet between the two. We're meeting with the Public Building Committee on March 21st. That's the time when we're going to address that in that committee to determine what those numbers look like, how the scope might be changed, how the amount of funding that we've initially requested might differ from what we need. But at this time, it's difficult to say with any kind of certainty what we might be coming back for if we're coming back, or what the scope would change if it has to change.
Although, if you, just for the public to prepare, the scope is potentially very large. It's in $5 to $7 million range, and I just want to put that out to the public.
That was the initial dollar figure given.
As we go through looking, and I do appreciate that, this is one of those situations where we'll be looking at scope, the various buckets that we have available to us, and I don't remember who made the point about timing. Do we phase it to try and get some of the lower courses? But this is going to be a challenge. One of the things I'm going to ask Amy to do, because this is going to be a challenge, and this is something we probably are going to want the voters to vote on because it's a very big decision, is we're required to hold a public hearing by April 10th. We can keep that hearing open until the new budget cycle, and this may be 1 year where we want to delay the referendum so that we can put this to a vote to the public and make sure that if there is a different change. So we may be doing multiple public hearings and ask Amy to evaluate what that would look like, what kind of notice we have to give, that sort of thing. So we may be looking at a referendum in May or June this year, just to give more time to figure this out. Because if we can't get that resolved...
Would it be a separate one, Lisa, or would it be everything you try to do at the same time?
I would try everything at the same time, so we only have to do one referendum. It's just more efficient for our staff and Susan, who's our registrar of voters. If we can do it all at once, that would be ideal. If it's more than
better turnout too.
Yeah, if it's more than 2% of the budget, we have to do it anyway, and that would just be 2 referendums. So if we can do it in one, it's better. We may not be able to do that, but that would then kick in the process of the supplemental appropriation, which is a little bit more complicated. If it's a large amount of money, again, it would be a second referendum. So those are the kind of things we're going to be evaluating and ask Amy to report back to us on the 22nd about how we could time that, and just let the public know that this is out there and that we may have to look at it. And I imagine that Wendy and her board, since they're the ones who actually do capital, you will be recommending to the Board of Selectmen, need time to evaluate whether they're going to change some of their priorities on how they spend from the American Rescue Fund based on this new information.
So a lot more specifics we need to get
precisely
on our end, and we just got this information
today.
So I just wanted to provide a heads up, and we have a meeting scheduled for Friday
And it may be that we can't get it done in time for referendum, and this will have to be a supplemental mid-year, and we understand that. To the extent we can, we should aim for that, but understood that we may not be able to. We're going to see a lot of that in the next few years, and I just want to get the public familiar with this concept because it is unusual. Never in our town's history have we done as many as I'm anticipating in supplemental appropriations, and I'm really very uncomfortable doing it because it's board approval instead of the public approval. But extraordinary times, extraordinary solutions, so we'll be looking into all those.
Certainly appreciate the flexibility and the timing.
Oh, absolutely. We understand what you're going through.
I think one of the other things that I know that I'll be focused on is, increased costs for value engineered product, which in my mind means pay more for less. So I would certainly want to see some level of analysis as to what we're acquiescing on from a cost from a quality perspective from original budget, even though that cost line item may end up being flat. So certainly, again, just want to know what we're paying for here, and to the extent there's any value engineering, would like to understand what that is.
Understood.
And also, to the extent we're paying, costs are going up, it would be very helpful if you can, you may not be able to do it, to get the operating costs, because I imagine this is one project where you're going to get some actual savings. And if we can start to plan that, it's a little easier to sort of explain the rationale. It's a spend to save in some ways, so it's not the true cost. So to the extent we can communicate that to the public, and we may not be able to, it depends on the engineering and stuff like that, but to the extent we can, it would be helpful, especially since we're going to be looking at some extraordinary changes. Yeah, go ahead, Art.
I realize you don't have all the details on this, and you just heard today, but can you give any further color or explanation of what you did hear today regarding the cost of Latimer?
The MEP systems, whether or not we're going with an entire geothermal system.
Could MEP help me out?
Mechanical engineering and plumbing. Those systems, when the construction manager originally priced them, was actually a little different than what the architect had originally included. So that's part of the redo of getting those numbers back. We're really not in a place. The 5 to 7 million was released, I would say, prematurely. I'm not real comfortable with how they came to that. So until we hear back from the group as to exactly where we are, there's not much more than conjecture at this point.
And we do have, just the process-wise, we do have a new town engineer who's done major construction. That's Tom Roy, so he can help. He's done a lot of procurement in difficult situations. He did all our procurement during the October 2011 storm, so he's fairly talented at that. So we'll let it play out, and we'd like to give you as much time. Obviously, if we can do a referendum in June, great, but if not, that's fine too. Just keep us posted.
Very good. Okay.
Wendy.
Am I allowed a question here?
You are.
Kind of for Amy. So given the timeline, right, not knowing till March 21st, like the actual or potential extra cost, or if there's a way to save on that $5 to $7 million, we're going to be discussing our budget, doing our workshop this Saturday, where we're going to be looking at all our capital needs and how we're going to allocate ARPA at that point in time. So I guess the question will be, like with Amy, as a policy decision, are we going to factor that into all of our decision making on Saturday to account for Latimer?
It's up to you. I personally wouldn't. They're not comfortable with the number. They're not even entirely sure what's in the number. I think it's kind of premature.
Okay.
I would just do your budget as you do it, and then when we can circle back with actual details and facts, I think that's when we should tackle it.
And then we would pull things, like change some of the projections or
up for discussion.
Spend.
Well, so I think you have a very difficult situation. You can't obviously act on what we don't know, but we do know that there's a potential out there.
Right.
So maybe you don't budget the full $7.5 million for fiscal year 23, and
Right.
you, with the understanding that you may want to or you may not want to do it, I mean, because ARPA isn't the only bucket the town has. We can go out to bond, we've got capital reserves, we can do value engineering. I mean, there are lots of buckets we can pull from, but that's one, and that's going to be a policy call for you guys, and working with Amy on that, and obviously in coordination with this board. But it's important for all boards to be aware of it, because there is this elephant in the room, and hopefully it's going to be a tiny little stuffed toy elephant, but it might be a real huge elephant. So we don't know, but it's to the extent we're thinking about it. So that's why you get paid the big bucks when.
Yep, I do. Thank you, Amy.
Are there any other questions on that? We did, I just want, for the members of the public, I do want to thank Matt, Amy, and Jason for getting us, we put forward a number of questions in advance to try and make this meeting less long, but of course we didn't accomplish that either. But thank you for getting us back that information. They were copied to Susan, she can share them with your board. And of course, if any board member has further questions, I know Matt has offered, and Susan as well, and actually I happen to know everyone in this room would take any questions from either the public or from our board members. So thank you to everyone who's worked on that. It is a tremendous amount of work, and we do appreciate everything you do, and to our teachers who really have had an extraordinary year. I say that because my son is in this, and my brother, and my sister-in-law, and my dad was a professor, so I'm a little biased, I realize that. But thank you to everyone who is doing this, and we know that it's still hard. And we do appreciate all the work everyone is doing, and we know that everybody's trying to do the best for the town, and we do appreciate. And, you know, truthfully, I just love seeing your faces. It's been such a pleasure to do that. So are there any other questions on the Board of Education budget before we move on to just final? Okay, and so Jason, just if you could get us an update on the HVAC project by the time it comes to us
I will
for
do
the
that.
hearing. Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you. Yeah, we have, no, I know, you don't want to hear the minutes, you don't want to hear the rest of the.
I'm staying.
Thank you, Wendy, that's very exciting. Before we do that, I just want to give a couple of quick updates. I'll take of where we are. I did have the opportunity to sit in on the first finance subcommittee meeting of the Board of Selectmen, where we talked about ARPA appropriations, and again, we'll be following the normal town process, which is in the town charter. So to the extent we can, let's do it in the town budget. If we can't, it'll follow the normal appropriation process listed in the charter. Because the Treasury has asked for detailed information on projects, we just are making the recommendation that you give the same level of specificity, at least, that's in the capital improvement plan, so that the public can understand what we're spending ARPA dollars on. And the other thing we did is we'll be talking about in the future, I sent this earlier, and I'm sure you guys read my long email because it's really exciting, but we do have a few policy issues coming up that our board will be looking at starting on March 22nd and going into the public hearing, and that's the budget modeling. Amy will have that updated for the 22nd so we can get a snapshot of where we are and what that looks like, and that will help us assist whether we want to feather in some of the grant-funded positions into the operating budget sooner rather than later. The pension investment assumption, we'll be taking a motion on that and voting on it next meeting, just for the public. We'll be looking, we've asked Amy to evaluate the debt service spike that is coming in next year, which is a 1.6 million, and just a quick review of that. The town manager is using an approach of budgeting cash for capital in the current year's budget. That would then go away next year so that the increase is lower. That's one way to sort of smooth the spike. So you use the cash for capital for needs in the out years, move them up when there's capacity, and then smooth the spike, but we'll talk about that later. The other things are assigning capital, adjusting the tax collection assumption rate, which we'll not be doing during this budget because we don't do major policy during the budget process, but we'll be looking at over the summer as part of a planned review. And there may be other areas that we can do. I think I don't know if I mentioned assigning capital reserves. We do have a substantial amount of capital reserves, and like when the Hartford left, we can assign money to help doing the smooth. So asked Amy to give us some options when we meet on the 22nd and possibly on the 23rd. The other thing Bert has mentioned and that our actuary mentioned is making an additional pension payment, and Derek can probably speak to this better than I, but it looks like our investment assumption is not going to hit target this year if we're like every other pension in the world. And so there will be a deficit, and even if without a deficit, she was recommending an additional pension payment. So we'll be asked Amy to evaluate sources and timing for that, and we're waiting on the experience study, so that likely will not be ready during the budget process, but will be done at end-of-year closeout. Derek has mentioned and will be continually focused on increased construction costs and how we plan for that, and how we're going to deal with future requests on that. And then capital reserves, it's a longer discussion. How much should we have, and when should we use it? And then finally, a couple of things. The motor vehicle valuation came in unusually high this year. Is that sustainable, or is that going to dip back down next year when the supply chain comes back, and how are we going to plan for that? And then last, of course, is the grand list forecasting. How can we get better projections so we can do better long-term planning? And that's a resource discussion that we'll continue to have and may not resolve ever, but make progress, not perfection there. A couple of things we're monitoring from the state is two things. There may be a mill rate cap at 29 mills, which will have an impact on our budget. It looks like right now, the projections we receive from the state would make Simsbury less whole by $200,000. I followed up with Representative Hampton. He's looking in to see if that was an error and see if we can get that corrected. The other thing that has come up is that the state is contemplating delaying revaluation and not implementing that this year, which will then change some of our long-term projections. So Amy's going to be working out modeling to accommodate those two scenarios that we can also evaluate. So it's going to be a super complicated year.
Assuming that that were the case, that wouldn't affect this year's grand list.
No, it would affect next year's, and it would affect sort of budget increases, and it's super complicated. And we'll try and anticipate that, but it's going to be. But it is important, because when you plan your debt, when the increases and the spikes, it is important to know how it's going to impact the grand list. So we'll be monitoring all that, but it's, again, going to be a super complicated budget, except that it's raining money everywhere, so we should be able to deal with it. I think we will, hopefully. And, all right, so with that, we'll go on to the minutes. I want to thank our clerk, another excellent job. If folks have had a chance to review the minutes, I'll ask for a motion to approve the minutes of February 15th, 2022.
I move to approve the minutes.
Thank you, Bert. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
We'll go with Mike since he's the new guy. Motion first and second. Any further discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
The motion passes unanimously, and we'll now take a motion to adjourn, please. Oh, sorry, wait, before we do, Amy, is there anything else that we need to be aware of?
No.
And there's nothing, I forgot to ask Matt before I left, is there anything material that we should be aware of that's out there that's coming up?
Not that I can think of, but if I come up with something, I'll let you know.
Other than that.
Sounds good. Okay.
I've got nothing.
All right. Anyone? All right. Motion to adjourn, please.
So moved.
Second?
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. We are adjourned. Thanks, everyone.